Hello, I'm Wes Allen. Welcome to the Must Reads Classics series sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence at Southern Methodist University. Now, in our Must Read series, we interview authors of newer homiletical works we hope our viewers will check out. In this classic series, we're revisiting some of the time-tested homiletical works that are worth rereading. Today, we're going back to the work of Henry H. Mitchell. Mitchell was a pioneer in Black studies broadly, the grandson of two preachers, and is considered the father of African-American homiletics. In his 1970 book, Black Preaching, it was the first scholarly work describing the cultural context, the sources, and unique practices of African-American homiletics and preaching in a positive way. In 1974, his Lyman Beecher lectures resulted in the book, The Recovery of Preaching, that shifted from description to prescription. And then in 1990, he published a book that combined parts of both of these two earlier books, Black Preaching, The Recovery of a Powerful Art. This book is still available from Abingdon Press. Among the enduring elements of Mitchell's work has been the claim that celebration is central to the Black preaching tradition. And that leads us to why we have Frank Thomas here with us today. Frank Thomas teaches preaching and directs the first PhD program in African-American preaching and sacred rhetoric at Christian Theological Seminary. While Frank's work goes off in many different directions, he has in part carried on Mitchell's theme of celebration with his own classic work, They Like to Never Quit Praising God. Frank, thanks for being with us. Could you just start us off by telling us a little bit about your introduction to Henry Mitchell and his work?
Thank you so much, Wes, for having me. This is just an honor. Henry H. Mitchell is one of my major mentors, so I'm just excited to share with you. I first met Henry Mitchell as a pastor. I was preaching every Sunday in a very small church in a rented facility. I was just out of seminary. We were trying to gather steam and get some land, build a building, etc. And I went to the bookstore and found his Recovery of. I also was struggling in my preaching style. And so I started looking for some resources, and I read Recovery of Preaching. And that to me is the most seminal book in all the books I've read on preaching after all these years. That Recovery of Preaching, I come back to it again and again and again. And from the Recovery of Preaching, I went back and read Black Preaching, which is the seminal work in 1970 that for me parallels, Cone's work in Black theology. Came out in 1969, Mitchell in 1970, and just groundbreaking work in terms of, describing a Black hermeneutic, trying to dig out of the oral tradition of African-American preaching scholarship. This whole question of folk preaching versus intellectual preaching. He went from Black hermeneutics to Black homiletics. He talked about the Black preaching style. He talked about pedagogy, how many African-American preachers, most didn't go to seminary, but he talked about the apprentice model of pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
Just groundbreaking stuff. Did some work on Black English or Black vernacular, did analysis of the Black sermon. It was just groundbreaking work. And I applied it as a pastor in a congregation, not as a scholar. I was preaching every Sunday, and I adopted the celebrated preaching model from Recovery of Preaching as my homiletical model in the pulpit. So I've been preaching in that model almost 38 years, and I owe a tremendous amount to Henry H. Mitchell.
Some of the things that you just mentioned that he talks about in these early works had been talked about in homiletics by white homileticians, but usually in a negative fashion.
Right.
And he flipped the discourse and lifted these up as positive elements.
One of the things that he says in Black Preaching is he was absolutely amazed at the amount of pride that the book received from Black preachers, meaning that, these are my words, once what was considered ignorance, buffoonery, emotionalism could be studied. Matter of fact, I got the quote, I pulled it. He says, the healing of their own self-esteem as practitioners of the Black tradition. All these years, they had followed African-American patterns with a kind of guilty conscience or wish for which they could somehow measure up to the established standards. Now they know that their tradition is widely respected by all, and they go back home to affirm themselves and their tradition with new commitment to refine it on its own terms by the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And that is absolutely true. Absolutely. And that's probably his greatest contribution, is that it lifted the self-esteem of African American preachers. And certainly not all African, some always knew the gifts and the genius, but it's something when you see a book that's recognized as scholarship that lifts the esteem. So he made that contribution. And let me also say, he put a call out in like 1988 for anybody who wanted to learn how to teach Black preaching. It was a D-Min program at United Theological Seminary. I wasn't interested in teaching Black preaching, or so I thought. I just wanted to get better as a pastor every day. So I enrolled in the D-Min program just to study with Henry Mitchell. That's the only reason I was there. I wanted to study. I wanted to get better at my preaching. I really wanted to learn. And in that program, I got to hear so much of his thinking, to experience him. And he came out with a book called Celebration and Experience in 1990. I was in the D-Min program from 89 to 91, 92 maybe, but 91 in there somewhere. And he handed out what was called blue line copies, which is right before going to press.
It's the last editing stage.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And he said, I want you all to critique, hand to the whole class. I want you to, next time we come, I want you to have a critique. So I wrote a 5-page critique of this thing. I mean, I went through it, every line of it, 5 pages. I came back, my classmates were laughing at me. Man, he didn't, he didn't ready to go to press. He didn't want any critique, but he took it seriously. And he went through every line of that critique. And so out of that, I said, you never define celebration. It's in the title, but what is it? So he said, you define it. And I wrote my thesis on it. And it became, They Like to Never Quit Praising God, the Role of Celebration in Preaching. And by that, Mitchell kind of anointed me, if I can use that in the best sense of the word, as following in his footsteps. Not that I ever intended to. He saw that I could do it. And so I'm teaching African American preaching, and we got African American PhD program in preaching. That's Henry Mitchell's, can we say, mentors pull out of us what we can't see in ourselves. I was just a pastor trying to get better. That's what I was saying. I wasn't trying to write books on Black preaching. I got people I approach every Sunday. But so Mitchell has just been a gift in my life and a tremendous, tremendous mentor and influence.
But that's a great story to hear, and the way he influenced you, it seems to me he still influences the wider guild that way. I mean, so much of the discussion of Black preaching, he foreshadowed. The themes he picked up are still being played out in scholarly literature. I mean, they're also moving beyond it, but he's clearly the shoulders a lot of people stand on.
Right. His concept of preaching to the whole person, that he developed is still being discussed in one form or another. He was in with the new homiletic, Charles Rice, Buttrick, Lowry, Craddock, that whole crowd that put this new he was in this intricate discussions, and the Lowry loop. And I remember in my thesis I put the Lowry loop as the center of the method. He said, no. He says, this, you preach every Sunday. We don't have loop to describe you describe your own homiletical method. Push me to the wall. Subsequently, situation, complication, resolution, celebrations,
Yeah.
But it's just unimaginable to me that a book or a series of books could have that much influence for this long in homiletics. And I think that everybody should pass by. I told you, in Intro to the Practice of African American Preaching, my book by Abington 216, there are 4 generations of teachers of African American preaching. And some of the contemporary names I lay out. Kenyatta Gilbert says Black preaching has, 2 sides. There is the Mitchell, he calls it rhetorical homiletics, And there's LaRue, who is the theological and and we haven't gotten past that yet, except for
Yeah.
womanism has brought in a whole new strand.
Yeah.
So that would be true, except for, the womanist homiletic, Lisa Thompson, Donna Allen, Kimberly Johnson, they brought in some fresh stuff, but still on the foundation of Mitchell's work.
I remember, of course, reading Mitchell early as a white student and all, and it expanded my own thinking about preaching. And I think especially his second book, that grew out of the Lyman Beecher lectures, was meant not just to continue raising the self-esteem for Black preachers, but it was to chasten the rest of us so that we might learn from that tradition as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh God, yeah. I told you I adopted it. I read this book as a pastor, and I adopted this method and been preaching it 38 years. I'm still preaching out of the fundamentals of this book right here. So not only, which is the beauty of his work, it appealed to the Euro-American audience and that audience, but it also appealed to Black folks because, as he says, there's some true stuff in here. This is just not made up.
Yeah.
Some of this stuff is true. And if it's true, it stands the test of time. And he's got some fabulous principles in preaching. I'm still teaching the celebrative, preaching model. And I still teach it.
Well, his work certainly has passed the test of time. Yes. And I'm so thankful for you taking a little time to be with us to promote this and invite people to go back and revisit these works because they are still available and still can fund our preaching and our learning today. So, Frank, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Wes, for this wonderful opportunity. Anytime. Thank you so much to talk about Henry H. Mitchell. It's just my honor.
We should, before we go, also just note at the very least that his wife Ella also wrote and edited works for homiletics, and especially women preachers. So that might be another interview we do on Ella's work. So everyone, we invite you back to visit this and our other series. You can find them on YouTube, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode of Must Reads Classics. Thank you.
Thank you.